excited to have as today's guest Ben Carson. Somehow my mother learned that Ben Carson was coming to Patrick Henry College, and I've got an email from her. Oh, I can't believe he's here. And I heard from my sister and my nephew and my daughter, who wanted to see if I could get him to autograph his book, which is really one of her favorites, Gifted Hands. It's a very powerful and inspiring story made into a motion picture that you'll want to see if you haven't already. Again, we're honored to welcome Dr. Carson and his wife, Candy. Welcome to you too. In 1987, Dr. Carson made medical history by separating a pair of Siamese twins who were joined at the back of the head. It was an operation that always killed one or both of the infants. Yet Dr. Carson led a 70-member surgical team to successfully separate the twins who are still living. He has, before and since, spearheaded a number of life-saving surgical innovations that broke new medical ground and have saved thousands. Dr. Carson has written 4 best-selling books, including the one I mentioned, Gifted Hands. He has a worldwide speaking tour and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States, by President George W. Bush. Dr. Carson's is the story of a man born for success and achievement, except his life didn't start out that way. He, in fact, grew up in poverty, was raised by a mother who herself was uneducated, but yet somehow instilled in her young son, who was struggling mightily in school, a love for education and learning that propelled him into honors programs in high school, on to Yale, the University of Michigan Medical School, and toward a truly remarkable medical career. Today he serves as the Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Please give Dr. Carson a warm welcome.
Well, thank you all for coming. I want to start out by doing something that, if you've come to previous interviews here, I haven't done, actually talking very positively about a couple of books. You know, I'm a journalist, I'm a magazine editor, tend to be more critical or even caustic than complimentary, but these books are really terrific. This is Ben's autobiography, Gifted Hands. Came out a couple of decades ago, but a new edition that's about a year or so old. And just a remarkable book that I want to recommend to all of you. I'll be asking about a couple of the highlights, but I hope you'll actually read this book. And then here's a new one that's just out this month, America the Beautiful, Rediscovering What Made This Nation Great. And I recommend this also, something unusual for me, but I want you to know that these are good things. Let's start with that difficult childhood that Dr. Veith was referring to. Yeah. Your mom actually was 13 when she got married. Your dad 28 when they got married. And when you were 8 years old, he ran off, and she's left pretty much alone, struggling to raise you and your brother. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, you know, she had only a third-grade education, and so she didn't have a lot of skills. So she was very observant, though. And she noticed that everybody she ever knew who went on welfare always stayed on welfare. They never came off of it. So she really didn't want to adopt that particular lifestyle. So she decided she would work as long and as hard as was necessary to keep us afloat. So she worked 2 to 3 jobs at a time as a domestic, cleaning people's houses. She would go from one job to the next, leaving at 5 in the morning, getting home around midnight. Sometimes we wouldn't even see her for a week because we would already be in bed by the time she came home, and she would leave before we got up. Yet we knew she was there. She would leave stuff out for us. She would leave food, and it was very important that she never adopted what I call the victim's mentality, and she wouldn't let us be victims either. Never felt sorry for herself. I think that was a good thing. But she never felt sorry for us either. That wasn't so good because because she would never accept an excuse. And if you came up with an excuse, she always said, "Do you have a brain?" And if the answer to that was yes, then she would say, "Then you could have thought your way out of that. You didn't have to do what Robert or John or Mary or Susan did." And, after a while, if people don't accept your excuses, you stop looking for excuses and you start looking for solutions. So I think that was an extremely, perhaps the most important thing that she passed on to me and to my brother. Be responsible.
And then in the fifth grade, you're getting zeros in school. You are being considered the dumbest kid in the class. And what happened to change that?
Well, I was what's known as the safety net. No one had to worry about getting the lowest mark on a test as long as I was there. So the kids really liked having me there. But my nickname was Dummy. That's what people called me. And I remember once we were having an argument about who was the dumbest person in the school. And it wasn't a big argument. Everybody agreed it was me. But then someone tried to extend the argument to who was the dumbest person in the world. And I said, "Wait a minute, there are billions of people in the world." And they said, "Yeah, we know that, and you're the dumbest one." So, and on that particular day, to make matters worse, we had a math quiz, and you had to pass your paper to the person behind you. They would correct it, give it back to you. Teacher would call your name. You had to report your score out loud. Great if you got 100 or 95. Not so great if you got a 0 and just had an argument about who's the dumbest person in the world. So, I started scheming. I said, when a teacher calls my name, I will just kind of mumble, and maybe she'll think I said something and write it down, and the girl behind me will think I said something else. So when she called my name, I said, "9." And she said, "9? Benjamin, you got 9 right? Oh, this is wonderful. I knew you could do it if you just applied yourself. Kids, I want you to understand what a significant day this is. Benjamin got 9 right." It had 30 questions. If he can get 9 right, anybody, And finally, the girl behind me just couldn't take it any longer. And she stood up and said, "He said none." Well, of course, the kids were rolling in the aisles. They were beside themselves. And if I could have just disappeared into thin air, never to be heard from again in the history of the world, I would gladly have done so. But I couldn't. So I had to sit there and act like it didn't bother me. But it did. Not enough to make me study, but it did bother me. And, but fortunately, my mother, when she saw all of these failing grades, she didn't know what to do. But she prayed and she asked God to give her wisdom to know what to do to get her young sons to understand the importance of intellectual development. And God gave her the wisdom, at least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was that wise, because it was to turn off the TV and let us watch only 2 to 3 TV programs during the week. And with all that spare time, we had to read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. And she would put little check marks and highlights and underlines and stuff. And I just hated it in the beginning. But, after a few weeks, I actually began to enjoy it, because we were desperately poor. But between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere, I could be anybody, I could do anything. I began to imagine myself in a laboratory conducting experiments, discovering new galaxies, microcosms. I began to know stuff that nobody else knew. And within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all of the students who used to call me Dummy. The same ones who called me Dummy in the 5th grade would come to me in the 7th grade, "Benny, how do you work this problem?" And I'd say, "Sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you." I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, I had the same brain. I just had a very, very different outlook at that point. And as I began to read, particularly about people of accomplishment, it dawned on me that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not the environment, it's not somebody else. You can actually take control of your own life. And I started having a very different philosophy than a lot of the people around me. And, a lot of them would call me names and nerd, Poindexter, Uncle Tom, all kinds of things. But I would always shut them up by saying one thing. I would say, let's see what I'm doing in 20 years, and let's see what you're doing in 20 years. And they must have believed me, because when I graduated from high school, they all voted me most likely to succeed, which means they knew what was necessary to succeed. They were too lazy and trifling to do it themselves. And that's what negative peer pressure is all about. And the more of our young people we can get to understand that, the more people of accomplishment we will see.
I also want to ask you about the role of GE College Bowl. GE College Bowl, no longer on television, was a weekly show pitting teams of college students against each other. Kind of a high-end Jeopardy, essentially. But you watched it.
It was my favorite TV program. Came on at 6 o'clock on Sundays. They would pit two colleges against each other, 4 contestants on each side, ask questions about science, math, history, geography. And I was actually very good at those things, so I wanted to be on College Bowl. But they would also ask questions about classical art and classical music. Now, I got to tell you, at Southwestern High School in Detroit, if you said something about Van Gogh, they would have said, put gas in it, the van will go. I mean, they would have had no idea what you were talking about. So, you know, I had to make an executive decision to learn all that on my own. I would get on the bus, go downtown to the Detroit Institute of Arts, roam through those galleries for days and weeks and months until I knew every picture, who painted them, when they were born, when they died, what period it represented. Always listening to my portable radio, Bach, Telemann, Mozart. And kids in Detroit thought I was nuts. I mean, can you imagine a black kid in Motown listening to Mozart? You know? And I tried to convince them that the Mo in Motown was for Mozart, but nobody was believing that. And I even decided which college to attend based on College Bowl, because I had enough money to apply to one college. I said, I'm going to apply to the college that wins the grand championship of College Bowl. Well, that year, the grand championship was between Harvard and Yale. And Yale just demolished Harvard, and I didn't want to go to a school with a bunch of dummies, so you know, I applied to Yale. Unfortunately, they accepted me with a scholarship. But the year I went there was the year College Bowl went off the air. So I know it's sad, but years later, when I decided that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, and you know, I said, what's the best place for neurosurgery? Johns Hopkins, Cushing, Dandy Walker, all the biggest names. The only problem is they only took 2 people a year out of 125 top applicants. So how was I going to get to be one of them? Well, it turns out when I went there for my interview, the guy in charge of the residency program, George Udrahai, was also in charge of cultural affairs at the hospital. And we talked a little bit about medicine, and then we started talking about neurosurgery, and then we somehow started talking about classical music. And we talked for over an hour about different composers and their styles, conductors, orchestras, orchestral halls. The man was on cloud 9. There was no way he wasn't taking me in the program. And, you know, I'd love to tell young people that story, because to emphasize the point that there's no such thing as useless knowledge. And you never know what doors it's going to come to open up for you. And some people say, yeah, you'll overload your brain. I'll tell you, as a neuroscientist, you cannot overload your brain. It is absolutely impossible. Your brain can easily contain all the information from all the volumes ever written since the beginning of the world and have plenty of room left over. So it's just not an issue.
And then you're at Yale, and you are taking the introductory course in chemistry, and disaster looms. And tell us what happens.
Well, you know, when I went off to Yale, I thought I was perhaps the smartest person in the world. And if not, certainly in the top 5. But it didn't take very long for me to be disabused of that. And by the time that first semester was over, I was thinking I was one of the dumbest people in the world. And I was failing freshman chemistry. I mean, I wasn't even close. And you can't fail chemistry if you're pre-med. You know, it just doesn't work. So, you know, the night before the exam, the final exam, I said, Lord, I always thought you wanted me to be a doctor, but obviously if I fail chemistry, I'm not getting into medical school. And so could you show me what it is you really want me to do? Or alternatively, and preferably, work a miracle. Well, as it turns out, the chemistry teacher, who was either very compassionate or very sadistic, I'm not sure which, had declared that anybody who was failing, he would give them double credit on their final exam. So you were encouraged to really study. So I was gonna memorize that whole chemistry textbook that night before the exam. But of course, I fell asleep, probably after page 5. And I dreamed I was in this big auditorium, just me, and a nebulous figure working out chemistry problems on the blackboard. And I awakened early in the morning, and that dream was so vivid. I quickly went to my textbook and started looking up the stuff I dreamed about. And when I went to take the exam the next day and I opened up the test booklet, I was shocked because the first problem was one of the ones I dreamed about. And the second, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, right through the book. I aced the exam. Needless to say, I'd just seen it the night before. And, that had a profound effect on me because I just thanked God, and I said, now I know you want me to be a doctor, and I know there's something you want me to do in the field of medicine, or you wouldn't have done that. And I said, I will never put you in that position again. And I will study hard, I will be diligent, and I'll make you proud. But that was a turning point in my life.
And were you going to church at this time, or did this? Tell us about.
Yes, I was faithful going to church because, Yale is a very secular institution, and people of faith are not necessarily the favorite people. But I found the church family, which was wonderful, and it gave me the stability I needed to get through, a very secular environment.
Now, students here are very diligent, always studying day and night, and nevertheless, occasionally having thoughts of perhaps romance or dating or courtship or whatever. Now, you wrote that you were pretty busy, and so but then you did meet Candy here. Maybe you can just tell us how that developed.
Well, I had steadfastly resisted relationships because I wanted to really be able to concentrate on my studies and get through medical school. And then it dawned on me that maybe that wasn't God's plan. And so I said, Lord, the next relationship that comes about, I will not resist. So please make sure it's the right person. So, it turns out that both Candy and I were from Detroit. And Yale had asked us if we would do some recruiting in the Detroit public high schools. And they would pay our way back for Thanksgiving because we didn't have enough money to go back home. So this was a great opportunity to be able to go home for Thanksgiving. And we were on their dime, so we got to go to restaurants and stuff. And we said, we kind of like each other. But on the way back to Connecticut, we were driving. And we were on Interstate 80. And Candy had fallen asleep already. But about Youngstown, Ohio, I fell asleep at the wheel, going 90 miles an hour. And was awakened by the vibration of the car as it was going off the highway into a ravine. And I awakened, I saw this, I grabbed the wheel and I started turning it. And the car literally started spinning like a spinning top. And, people say your life flashes before your eyes just before you die. It's true. All these scenes from my life were going. And I said, this is it. And then the car stopped in the correct lane on the shoulder of the road, just in time for me to pull off before 18-wheeler came barreling through. This, of course, woke Candy up. And she said, what's going on? And I said, go back to sleep. But but actually we started talking, and, we said, the Lord obviously spared our lives for a reason. And he has something that he wants us to do. And that was actually the night we started going together. It was the 28th of November. And we still celebrate the 28th of each month, every month now, for that reason.
And you've been married now, how old?
It'll be 37 years,
37 years?
in July.
And then medical school, the University of Michigan.
That was a little traumatic because when I started medical school, the first set of comprehensive exams I did very, very poorly on, to the point that my advisor asked me to drop out. He said, you know, you're not cut out to be a doctor. This is a hopeless situation, but we can get you into another discipline. Well, that's just what you want to hear after you've spent your whole life since you were 8 years old thinking you wanted to go to medical school. You get in and your advisor tells you to drop out. So I went home to my apartment and I just prayed and I said, Lord, help me. And I started thinking, what kind of courses do you do well in and what kind of courses do you struggle in? And I realized I did well in courses where I did a lot of reading, and I struggled in courses where I listened to a lot of boring lectures. And there I was listening to 6 to 8 hours worth of boring lectures every day. So I made an executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend that time reading. And the rest of medical school was a snap after that. And years later, when I went back there as the commencement speaker, I was looking for that advisor because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be an advisor. But, you know, because some people are just so negative. They can always figure out why you can't do something. They can't come up with a good reason why you can.
Yeah. By the way, this whole thing about skipping lectures and all that, so
that's only boring lectures.
right. We're going to get to some current political and policy matters. So I just want to jump now to a couple of the innovative things you did as a neurosurgeon, including hemispherectomy.
Yes.
Maybe you can tell about that. How many of you know what a hemispherectomy is? Okay, a couple people. Good.
Okay. Well, early in my career, I was approached by one of the elderly pediatric neurologists about a little girl from Denver who was having 130 seizures a day. And nothing they could do could control it. They even had put her into a coma, a pentobarbital coma. And he said, you know, there's a procedure called hemispherectomy that's kind of fallen out of favor, but she might be a candidate for that. And, you know, I'd done some reading about it. And I had come to the conclusion that the reason that it had fallen out of favor is because they didn't really know what was going on, particularly in the postoperative period. And they didn't have CAT scanners back then when it fell out of favor. And I said, you know, we can do this now because we can figure out what's going on and we can react to it. And so I did a hemispherectomy on this little girl, and it was a huge news story. And she was very photogenic, as was her mother, and it was all over the country. And then all kinds of people started coming for hemispherectomies. And
in a hemispherectomy, you're actually taking out
half the brain, right? And you know, we worked out techniques to be able to do it more safely. And it went from being something that had fallen out of favor to something that is done in virtually all children's hospitals now. So I was just privileged to be able to play a role in helping to bring that back. There have been many improvements on the technique now from the time when I was doing it, and it continues to be improved so that you don't actually even have to take the whole hemisphere out now. There are ways that you can disconnect everything, but still leave the hemisphere there, which greatly reduces the danger of the operation.
And people, there's sometimes the joke about half of your brain tied behind your back or something, but people actually, they actually are able to...
They're actually able to function because of something called plasticity, which means that part of the brain that remains in a young person can actually take over functions from the other side. It doesn't work in adults.
Okay. And then separating the Siamese twins conjoined at the head.
Yeah, I had become fascinated with the whole concept of conjoined twins months before I heard anything about the twins from West Germany, the Bender twins, and I started reading about it and trying to figure out why the results were so dismal, and I concluded that it was exsanguination or bleeding to death. and talked to a friend of mine, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Hopkins, who had done a lot of experimental work and now clinical work with hypothermic arrest, where you actually pump the blood out of the body, you cool the body until the heart stops, pump the blood out, and then you can operate on the heart for up to an hour before you have to restore the circulation. And I said, you know, if you could do that during the critical part of a Siamese twin separation, I bet it would work. And then I just put the ideal aside, and I said, why am I thinking about this? In my whole lifetime, I'm never going to see a set of conjoined twins. 2 months later, lo and behold, here came the German doctors presenting this case to a lot of medical centers, trying to see if anybody had a solution, because the mother refused to accept the European recommendations that she choose one twin. And that they
one to live, one to die.
Exactly, she couldn't do it. And when I explained what I was thinking about, everybody got very enthusiastic. And we put together a team, and we planned it for 5 months, including little mannequins and all kinds of things. And it was a 22-hour operation, but it worked. And it was really quite an amazing thing. And I had told my wife that it was probably going to be a life-changing event for us because, you know, they say everybody gets 15 minutes of fame. Well, I had already had 2 15 minutes of fame with the hemispherectomies and with intrauterine surgery, doing an operation on a twin baby while it was still in the mother's womb. And I said, you know, if there's a third 15 minutes, I said, the media's not stupid. And they'll say, wait a minute, isn't that the same guy? And then they'll start looking into my background, and they'll say, wow, can you imagine? And I said, our lives will never be the same. And they never have been. But fortunately, I've realized that the most important thing is maintaining your relationship with God and allowing Him to use you. And He's been able to do that in a very effective way. And I realized that even though all these things kept happening to me, it wasn't because I was so great. It was because I was willing to allow Him to lead in my life.
Yeah. One thing among many things that I like in this book is that there are personal stories. I mean, individual patients. Miranda, Beth, who after the operation, people were wondering if she could always be comatose, and she says, "My nose itches,"
right,
and so forth. Denise, Bobo. But you also mentioned some deaths. Mm-hmm. Jennifer, Danielle. I mean, as you think back, do you think more about the lives saved or the lives that didn't make it?
Well, I think about both, but the way I've always looked at it, it's only a failure if you don't learn something from it. Mm-hmm. And anything that doesn't work out the way you want it to, you need to figure out exactly why it didn't work out that way and what could you do to make it better. And as long as you look at a failure that way, you're likely to continue to advance. You know, Thomas Edison said he knew 999 ways a light bulb did not work. Mm-hmm. You know, you just don't give up. You know, there's the cleaning formula 409. Why do they call it that? The first 408 didn't work. You just keep working at it, and then you will be successful if you look at it that way.
And you're always telling the parents that this may work, it may not, but if you don't do anything, the child's going to die.
Exactly. Yeah, the so-called BWA, the best worst analysis. Yeah. You know, I asked 4 questions. What's the best thing that happens if we do this? What's the worst thing that happens if we do it? What's the best thing that happens if we don't do it? And what's the worst thing that happens if we don't do it? And by asking those questions, not just in medicine, but almost any big decision in life, it really helps you to hone in on the right answer pretty quickly.
Well, let's turn to some policy questions, particularly in this book. There's a discussion of health care and so forth, very much in the news. And I'm just wondering, as health care, what's called Obamacare, as that went through Congress, did anyone ask those 4 questions about that?
Obviously not. But, you know, I would be the first to admit that we need health care reform. Mm-hmm. I mean, we spend twice as much per capita on health care in this country as, you know, most other nations. And yet we have terrible access problems, terrible efficiency problems. And it's largely because we do things the wrong way. You know, if you get an appendectomy in New York versus Los Angeles versus Percyville versus Baltimore, different costs, different ways of submitting bills, different ways of collecting, all of which justifies the mountains and mountains of paper and the armies of people to push them around, all of whom have to be paid out of the healthcare dollar. Absolutely asinine, because every single diagnosis has something known as the ICD-9 code. Every procedure has something known as the CPT code, and we have computers, which means all billing and collection can be done instantaneously without all of that cost. And the reason we don't do it is because insurance companies say, well, if it were that easy, some practitioner would say that I did 2 appendectomies when he only did 1, so he could get paid twice. Well, first of all, very, very few doctors would do such a thing. And secondly, the answer to that is not a gigantic, expensive bureaucracy, but what I call the Saudi Arabian solution. Why don't people steal in Saudi Arabia? You chop their limbs off bit by bit, Well, I wouldn't necessarily chop their limbs off, but there would be some real teeth in the punishment. Loss of your license for life, no less than 10 years in prison, loss of all your personal assets. Do you think anybody would even think about it? No, they wouldn't. And they would check every bill 7 ways to Sunday to make sure it was right. It just would not be an issue. Just like in Sweden, there's no drunk driving. Why is there no drunk driving in Sweden? Because the penalties for drunk driving are so severe and are uniformly applied. So, that's how you solve that kind of problem. And there are multiple other things that I talked about in healthcare. We have logical ways of solving these problems without making them into a political football. And the amount of money that we spend is far more than adequate to make sure that everybody has good health care in this country.
You were telling me before that you did get a couple of calls from the White House during this whole thing asking for your advice, in a sense, but what happened?
Well, the first call I got, I was having quite a decent conversation with the gentleman about the ideal that is talked about and some of the other ideals I have. And he was pretty enthusiastic. And then he said, what did you do for the president during the campaign? And I said, well, I'm an independent. Clunk, end of that conversation. Well, they must have thought better of it. A couple of months later, I get another call. I'm teaching a class. And I said, well, I'm in the middle of teaching a class right now. Can we talk in about 40 minutes? The individual was incensed. I mean, how could you possibly be doing something more important than talking to the White House? So that was the end of that conversation. And unfortunately, that kind of attitude pervades. I was talking to David Axelrod about it, and he said, yeah, we have a few people who are perhaps not as professional as they should be working here. I wonder where that comes from. But at any rate, I did protest, and I actually talked to senior administration officials about Obamacare and some of the good things about it, like lifetime limits and pre-existing diseases. And I said, these are things that I think everybody could agree with, that perhaps should be placed on the table for a vote, but don't just sort of jam this gigantic thing through because it will alienate people. I say there will not be cooperation in Congress, for the rest of this administration. You'll get nothing done, and that's not going to be beneficial to the people of the nation. But people were quite stubborn. They wouldn't listen, and we find ourselves in exactly that situation.
Yeah. I'll go to questions from the audience in just a moment, but let me ask, if you were king of the forest and trying to have a more logical medical care system, what would be the basics of it?
Well, the basics of it would be I would go to the electronic medical record and electronic billing system that I just talked about. I would make the government responsible for catastrophic health care and insurance companies only responsible for routine health care, because they hide behind the catastrophic thing to keep jacking up their rates. And if you made them responsible only for routine health care, you could predict how much money they're going to have to put out, and you could regulate them just like you do utilities. If you didn't regulate utilities, nobody may afford their water or their electricity either. And, I would, in terms of the people who have no health care, I would basically set up a system similar to food stamps, where you give them an electronic health account, and it's replenished every month, just like food stamps are. But now they would be incentivized not to blow it by going to the emergency room where it costs 5 times more than it does in a clinic. You know, when Mr. Brown gets that diabetic foot ulcer, instead of going to the emergency room, he'll go to the clinic. They do the same thing in both places, but in the emergency room, they patch him up and send him out. In the clinic, they patch him up and say, now, Mr. Brown, let's get your diabetes under control so you're not back here in 3 weeks with another problem. And we begin to deal with some preventive care. And that's how we're going to be able to get these things under control. It's lots of logical solutions that I talk about in the book for that and for a number of other things for that matter. It seems like logic has simply been thrown out of the window. And a lot of it stems around, special interest groups. I say that anything that doesn't make sense that comes out of Washington, there's a special interest group behind it. And they're the one who are driving the bus. And we've empowered special interest groups because we have so many people who want to maintain their office all the time, so they have to have money all the time. And this was not foreseen by the Founding Fathers because they didn't think people would want to be in office all the time because it was a sacrifice. Now it's not a sacrifice anymore. Now it's gravy. And so, at some point we need to rediscuss this. Maybe it's time for another constitutional convention.
Okay, it's time now for some questions from you all. The mic's over there, raise hand, and you'll get it in your hand. Another mic over here, too. Stunned silence.
Thank you so much for coming today. I just want to get your opinion on whether you think that the recent change mandating that all medical records be basically put into electronic form and centralized, do you think that that has been a good idea?
No, I don't think that making everybody's medical records available to the government is good. The government is big enough and intrusive enough as it is. If you go back and you read the ideal that the founders had, and you'll read a lot of that in this book, they had never intended for the government to grow so large and so intrusive and to be so involved in so many parts of our lives. And in fact, they said that it is absolutely critical, if the United States is to maintain itself as a free and prosperous nation, that the people be well informed and that the people be active in government. What we have done is we've withdrawn, we've become much less well informed. We get a lot of our information from the media rather than actually understanding the depth of what we believe in. And the void has been filled by the government, which has grown larger and larger and larger. So now we're becoming, instead of a nation for, of, and by the people, a nation for, of, and by the government. As that continues, we become less of a can-do nation and more of a what can you do for me nation, exactly what they had dreaded and hoped would not occur.
Let me just ask while folks are cogitating about further questions. Because I had a discussion with one of my sons a couple weeks ago on this question of medical care, and I was actually, amazingly enough, suggesting the division of catastrophic versus normal things. And he was saying, well, where do you draw the line there? How would this actually work out in practice?
Well, you have to do it at a monetary amount.
Okay.
So, I would do it at the $200,000 level when a disease process reaches a point where you've gone to that level. That's where the other insurance kicks in. Right. Okay. And the other good thing about doing it that way is if catastrophic health care becomes a government responsibility, it forces us to look at it seriously. Yeah. Right now, 40 to 50% of healthcare dollars are spent during the last 6 months of a person's life. Now, that makes absolutely no sense at all. But then we would start, examining this thing. It has to go hand in hand with tort reform, because a lot of the driver is that people are afraid not to do something because they would be sued. And so until we get a handle on tort reform, we're never going to get a handle on a lot of other costs. And, during the healthcare debate, the administration was saying, well, the malpractice stuff, that's about $5 billion a year. No. That's a tiny fraction of what it is. It's sort of a whole pyramid of things that are dependent upon it, and they're not looking at those things.
Yeah.
Dr. Carson, a lot of the students that come to school here at Patrick Henry College have been homeschooled, and there are a lot of moms and dads also here in the audience who are homeschool parents. And I was just wondering what you would say to that style of education and how you would encourage those families.
Well, I think homeschooling, particularly in the current environment, can be an extremely good thing because I'm familiar with a lot of homeschooling groups, and they've actually learned how to organize themselves so that one parent who's particularly good in one subject teaches actually several kids, and then another parent who's very good teaches kids in another area, and they arrange field trips and all kinds of things, and they don't have to be bothered with all the political correctness. So they can actually concentrate on what they're trying to learn. In 1831, when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study what was going on here, because the Europeans were fascinated. Here was a nation barely 50 years old, which was already competing with Europe on virtually every level. How in the world was that possible? So they were interested in finding out. Well, he decided to look at our school system and was flabbergasted to see that anybody finishing the second grade was completely literate. He could go out and find a mountain man, and they could read the newspaper, and they could have an intelligent discussion with them. And, you go and look at some of the letters from the Wild West, that were written, in 1800. Look at the grammar and the syntax and the vocabulary of those people. You would think it was, Professor Lasky writing those letters. Amazing, what has changed the way we've dumbed things down over the course of time. And if you really want to be impressed, and there's examples in the book, America the Beautiful, of questions that you were required to answer for a 6th grade exit exam in the 1800s. Now, I doubt that most college graduates today could pass that exam. We've dumbed things down to that level, and we need to reassert ourselves in the educational arena. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the international surveys looking at the ability of students in multiple countries to solve math and science problems, and that we rank right near the bottom of that now. This is not the way it used to be. We used to be the envy of the world. Starting about the 30s, as we started to become more and more politically correct, we began to get rid of the essential things, and we started adding in things that really are not particularly important to be taught in school, or perhaps things that should be taught in the home. But in the process, as we've evolved more and more into a politically correct situation, we don't even want to talk about what the family's supposed to do versus what the school's supposed to do, what the responsibilities are of fathers and mothers, and it really has degenerated to that level, not because our whole society has degenerated to that level, but because the loudest voices, and particularly the media, has tried to pretty much force that upon people, and people have not stood up. People have not spoken out. This country was supposed to be for, of, and by the people, but the people have become silent. Very much like the people in Nazi Germany were silent. Most of them did not agree with what Hitler was doing, but they kept their mouths shut, and you see what happened. And exactly the same thing will happen to the freedoms that we enjoy in America and the kind of nation that we've had if people don't speak up. They need to rise up. They need to say to political correctness, take a hike. This is who we are. This is what we believe in. These are the principles that allowed us to become the pinnacle nation in the world in record time, and we're not about to throw them out of the window for the sake of political correctness.
Hand up over here. Go ahead.
For someone who's looking to become a doctor, your story really is inspiring, sir, and I thank you for coming to talk to us. My question is that should the government regulate moral issues like abortion and stem cell research? Should they, and if so, how?
Well, the government should regulate moral issues like not killing people. And, you know, we have a very good moral code upon which our government was based. It was a Judeo-Christian code, and it's well established. Now, can you get a little bit too involved in everybody's lives? Absolutely, you can. It should not be necessary. And, you know, I believe that people should be allowed to do what they want to do as long as it is not interfering with somebody else's rights. Now, somebody might say to me, how can you say that and yet you're pro-choice? Because being pro-choice means that you're interfering with this woman's right to have an abortion.
Being pro-life. So, you mean being pro-life?
Yeah, some people would say that.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay,
Gotcha.
but what I would say is, it seems to me that when you're aborting a baby, you're interfering with that baby's rights. You know, does that baby not have a right to life? Just because that baby happens to be in the most protected environment that they can possibly be in, do they abrogate all rights to life? And I was talking to the head of the ACLU about this, and you know, he was talking about how the ACLU is there to speak for those who can't speak for themselves and protect the rights of everyone, you know. And I said, okay. There was this woman who came to me. She was 33 weeks pregnant, and her baby was diagnosed with hydrocephalus on ultrasound. And they had encouraged her to get an abortion, so she was on her way to Kansas, which was the only place you could get an abortion that late, right. And but stopped to talk to me before going, and fortunately I convinced her to keep the baby. The baby was born, did have hydrocephalus, had a shunt placed. She loves that baby. But I said to him, I said, did that baby have any rights? Would you speak up for that baby? 33 weeks. That baby could exist outside the womb without support. Would you speak up for that baby? Yeah, he danced around a little bit. I said, well, let me make it easy for you. I said, we have other babies, 26 weeks, 27, 28-week gestation, much younger than this baby, but they're already out. They're in an incubator. We're doing all kinds of things. How about that baby? Would you advocate for that? Oh, absolutely, no problems with that baby. I said, so the one that is several weeks more advanced, that's in the most protected place it can be, you have trouble advocating for that one, but the other one, you can. And he said, I realize that doesn't make any sense. He says, but I believe that a woman has a right to kill that baby until the second it is born. And I said, will you say that in public? He said, no. But, you know, that's what we're dealing with. So, you know, you have to be able to look at the big picture when you're talking about intrusion into rights. Woman, do you really have a right to kill the baby just because it's in your body? You know, it harkens back to the argument, you know, decades ago about slavery. When slave owners thought, I own this person, I should be able to do anything to them that I want. Well, obviously our thinking has evolved, fortunately, over the course of time. But it's the same kind of situation.
What's your assessment of the medical systems in places with socialized medicine, like Canada and Great Britain?
Well, interestingly enough, a lot of the places with socialized medicine, you know, Great Britain, you probably just heard this week, is looking at trying to do some privatization. because they're running out of money. You know, the problem with socialized medicine is that you just can't seem to keep up with the cost over the course of time. And the only way to do that is you have to ration. And so that's why in a lot of the places with socialized medicine, if you're 60 years old, you may not get a kidney transplant. You may not have a hip replacement. Sorry, you're just too old. Which is absolutely absurd. You know, we have 80 and 90-year-olds who are vibrant, intellectually vibrant, who are, you know, contributing to society. You don't make those decisions based on age. You have to make those decisions based on condition. And, you know, there's some 30-year-olds who have, you know, 600 other conditions which make them non-viable, you know, who would be much less of a good candidate than a 60-year-old for that. And socialized medicine, socialism in general has a problem of not distinguishing things. Everything has to be this, everything has to be that. And when you begin to do that, the individualism disappears, and that's what America is all about. So clearly it's not a system that works for us. And, you know, as I've stated very clearly in the book, there are some things about socialism that are actually good. There are many things about capitalism that are good. There is no one system that is all good and one system that is all bad. But that's why we should have a democracy. That's why we should be able to have a debate. That's why we should be able to talk openly, not through the constraints of political correctness, so that we can chart a course that is forward rather than just always lurching to the right or the left. You know, in the book I talk about the eagle as one of our symbols. Well, one of the things about it is that it has two wings. It has a right wing and it has a left wing. Now, you know, if it's all right wing, guess what happens? It veers to the right and crashes. If it's all left wing, it veers to the left and crashes. And, you know, that was one of the symbolisms of the eagle. You know, there's give and take. And, you know, once we learn to do that, once again, I think we will be able to fly forward rather than continuing to lurch to the right and lurch to the left, which is what we've been doing for the last several decades and not making very much progress.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. As somebody who's interacted with more doctors probably than the average person, I know that there tends to be kind of a sense that doctors have sort of a reputation for being tongue-in-cheek because you want to give people the most honest possible assessment of the situation that they're in and not, you know, build up false hopes or, you know, be too overly sanguine about anything. But at the same time, you want to instill optimism in people and you want to, you know, encourage people to be hopeful through the kinds of things that they go through as you're helping them as a doctor. So my question is, how do you balance maintaining a sense of optimism with your responsibility to be honest and open with people?
Well, honesty and openness is by far the most important quality. And people know, and you know, if you've been dealing with a lot of physicians, you know when people are being honest with you. And you know when they're giving you, you know, a bunch of crap. And, you know, it becomes part of your persona if you truly care. Now, if you don't care, you know, anything goes. But if you actually care about people and you have time to sit down with them, to explain things to them, which is what I always do, to make sure that they're a part of the decision-making process, okay? That way they have buy-in. And really, no matter what happens, good or bad, they have buy-in. And that's the way that medicine is supposed to be done. That's the way that I teach all the students and the residents and interns that I work with in order to do it. And if you do that, you're much less likely to end up in a lot of conflicts. You're much less likely to end up in court because, you know, everybody's involved in the decision-making process, not just the high and mighty doctor.
We all have, at some stage, the experience of being invited to fill out an organ donation card. And I have a friend who, as a college student, her life was saved because of a liver transplant. I'm wondering if you have an opinion as a medical professional about the current ethical atmosphere in the medical profession, the trustworthiness of that decision when someone is lying in a hospital, grievously injured. What is the process, the ethical process that goes on to decide whether that person lives or dies and whether they're a good candidate for organ donation? Can we trust the medical profession now to save lives?
Virtually every transplant program in the country has an ethics committee associated with it that includes, members of the medical profession, members of the clergy, social workers, patient advocates, in order to be able to get, all the different points of views, for the very reason that if you left it in the hands of any one particular group that had a particular bent to doing something, then you're much more likely to have some bias introduced. So that's the very reason that they virtually all have ethics committees associated with them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carson. As someone who wants to become a teacher eventually, I was wondering, in the 5th grade, what do you think would have been the most helpful thing that that teacher could have done to help you succeed?
Okay, good question. I think I did have a 5th grade teacher that did do a lot to help me. If you saw the movie, Mr. Jake, the 5th grade science teacher, he came in one day, and this was while I was still the dumbest kid in the class, and he held up a big black shiny rock, and he said, "Can anybody tell me what this is?" Well, bear in mind, I never raised my hand. I never answered any questions. So I waited for one of the smart kids to raise their hand, and none of them did. So I waited for one of the dumb kids to raise their hand, and none of them did. And I said, "This is my big chance." And up went my hand, because I had been reading. And when my mother made us start reading books, I actually started reading about rocks, about geology. And I actually knew a lot about it. Nobody knew about this, but I could identify virtually any rock and where it came from and how it was formed. So, I raised my hand. Everybody turned around and looked. They said, "Look, Carson's got his hand up. Oh, this is going to be good." And the teacher was shocked. And he said, "Benjamin?" And I said, "Mr. Jake?" I said, "That is obsidian." And there was silence in the room, because it sounded good. And nobody knew whether it was right or wrong. They didn't know whether they should be impressed or whether they should be laughing hysterically. And finally, after he got over his shock, Mr. Jake said, "That's right. It is obsidian." And I said, "Obsidian is formed after a volcanic eruption. The lava flows down, it hits the water, there's the supercooling process, the elements coalesce, the surface glazes over." Everybody was staring at me, They could not believe all this geological information spewing forth from the mouth of the dummy. But I was probably the most amazed person, because it dawned on me at that moment that I wasn't really stupid at all. I said, "The reason you knew all that information is because you were reading books." I said, "Aren't you tired of being called a dummy?" I said, "What if you read books about all your subjects? Can you imagine what the effect would be?" And from that point on, no book was safe in my grasp. But that same day, Mr. Jake, the 5th grade science teacher, he asked me to come to the laboratory, and he started helping me put together a rock collection. And then I got involved with helping take care of all the animals in the laboratory. There was a red squirrel and a tarantula, a Jack Dempsey fish, crayfish, all kinds of cool stuff. There was a microscope. I started being able to look at the water specimens and seeing all kinds of microscopic creatures, and I started learning all their names. And, it really just began to open up science for me and gave me the incentive to really continue to drive forth and to become a much better student.
Thank you so much for speaking to Dr. Carson. You mentioned earlier that a large percentage of funding for medical care is used within the last few months of a person's life. I know this has been an issue in my state particularly, but how would you recommend that we provide compassionate end-of-life care without breaking the bank?
Okay. Well, first of all, we need to recognize when we have a terminal situation. And most people in medicine know that already, but there are some people who are unscrupulous, who do procedures because, we get paid for procedures. There are some people who are afraid that if they don't do something, somebody's going to come back and say, why didn't you do something? So we have to remove the fear of being sued, and we have to disincentivize people from doing procedures for procedures' sake, and looking more at outcomes than we do at procedures. That's one of the things that will help enormously in taking care of that group of people. We also have to expand hospice care, and we have to make it easy for people to be able to go home when they have certain kinds of conditions, and to be at home among loved ones, and to be kept comfortable. And, we have to, abandon the phobia of, somebody becoming a drug addict, because they're in pain and they're about to die, and we don't want to give them drugs because they might become a drug addict. Give me a break. They're going to be dead in 2 months. So, we just need to integrate a little bit of logic and compassion into that care and make it easier. And I was talking to a woman that I operated on this week, yesterday in fact, because she had a condition called trigeminal neuralgia, a very painful condition of the face. It's the only thing that I treat in adults. But her husband had just died 2 weeks earlier. But she was so grateful for the fact that he was able to be home during his last period of time, and that all the children could come and all the relatives, and he was happy when he died, rather than being poked and prodded and stuck in some kind of unit. And so real compassion is being able to allow people to die in dignity, and I think we've confused what compassion really is.
We're going to have to cut this off. Just want to ask one last question. In 1997, when you spoke at the presidential prayer breakfast, and you were told by someone, don't mention Jesus, and you did. In 1999, after the terrible shooting at Columbine High School, and you're speaking there and you're told not to mention God, and you did. Why do you do that, and why is it important for Christians to do that, even when they're told don't?
Well, because I cannot separate who I am from what I believe. And, when the movie was being made, the major sponsor said, this is not a movie for Christian audiences, this is for the general audience. So you can't have all this God stuff in there. And I just said, if you want to take God out, then take me out and make it about somebody else, because it won't be about me. And, I think, if we are Christians, and if we are true Christians, then we have to be willing to stand up for what we believe. Very much in the same sense that I said, America will lose its soul if people don't stand up and talk about who they are. The same thing happens with Christians. If we don't talk about who we are, and who we are should not be shameful to anybody, because the Bible says, you shall know that they are Christians by their love. And, if you care about people and you manifest that, why would that be something to be ashamed of?
Please join me in thanking Dr. Ben Carson.